of the goofier arguments among video game collectors is, does this game count? In other words, is a particular cartridge part of a given set of games? My view is, it's up to the individual collector, and they should be consistent about it. So if one were to want all of the Famicom games to play, then Final Fantasy I-II wouldn't count. But for the purposes of Famidaily, I defined it as all of the commercially released Famicom cartridges, and so I am left with this odd little rump. This isn't even the only Famicom cartridge that's a collection of 2 previously released games. The Sharp Famicom TVs had a pack-in that was Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong Jr. Math, presumably chosen so that they could reuse a lot of the graphics memory. Since that was a pack-in, I didn't talk about that one. This is the first Famicom game by Squaresoft, and that's because when the company released their previous Famicom game 4 years ago, they were still just Square. Final Fantasy III is what really put them on the map, and they had been pumping out Final Fantasy games like crazy since then. In fact, a month after they released Final Fantasy I-II, Squaresoft releases Final Fantasy VI. That's how deep into the timeline we've gotten here. Squaresoft might have been in the middle of becoming a powerhouse in the mid-90s, but in the 80s, Square was tiny, and they really didn't release a whole lot of Famicom games. Early on, they stuck with action games, and most of these weren't very good. The big exception being Highway Star, which was the definitive Famicom racing game for a long time. After the release of Final Fantasy, Square stuck exclusively to RPGs, which of course is where they found their real success. And speaking of RPGs, Final Fantasy I-II is also the final RPG release on the Famicom. The Famicom has given us a lot of things. It was the laboratory where genres were formed, and the single most important contribution that the Famicom made to video games was making RPGs mainstream in Japan. Overseas, a lot of that was invisible. People who played RPGs were on computers, and they stuck by them. The game magazine Famitsu published this chart in 1990. It shows what they consider to be the evolution of RPGs, tracking their development all the way back to 1986. It's this way because they were a magazine dedicated to the Famicom, and all of the pink bubbles are Famicom releases. It's a complete explosion of concepts and styles. In the space of a few years, RPGs had become the dominant video game genre in Japan. The first Famicom RPG was a computer port, Bokusuka Wars. It's the evolutionary equivalent of the lungfish. It has all of the basic traits of an RPG, with character advancement through combat, but a lot of it is missing. As you might expect, things really got underway with Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest took the principles of a couple popular computer RPGs and filtered them down to something that worked well on a console. Now people had a pattern that they could follow, and pretty soon everyone had a Dragon Quest clone. But a lot of people weren't satisfied with just copying Chunsoft's game. Some people sought success by bringing over popular computer games, and a division formed between dungeon crawlers, the Dragon Quest style, and action RPGs. It all came to a head in the first few months of 1990, when every single major RPG franchise on the Famicom had a release within the space of 8 weeks. And if there's any RPG on the Famicom that could be called the greatest, it's Dragon Quest III. Look, the game literally broke the country of Japan. Dragon Quest IV might have been better, but it didn't shut down the entire country for a few days. And so I returned to Final Fantasy I-II. Games that were decent successes on release, but not enormous standouts. I get the impression that Square decided to make this re-release mainly to promote the series in general to people who are still using the Famicom. And I get the impression that this particular re-release did okay for 1994. At least it's the cheapest 1994 release you can find. My copy cost 500 yen, though that was 10 years ago. As for how the games play, well, I've got 2 episodes on that already. They didn't apply any bug fixes here. There's a couple of typo corrections, and they tweaked some graphics so that they weren't copyright violations. But this is just Final Fantasy I and II on one cartridge. There's nothing more to it than that.